Hey baddies! In this episode of Called to Be Bad, pastor and author of the book Jesus Takes a Side, Embracing the Political Demands of the Gospel, Jonny Rashid shares his experience of living as an Arab American during political upheaval in the United States, and his realization that politics are always personal. They're always embodied and personal. We discuss the dangers of moderate politics and how polarization may not be as bad as people often think it is. Jonny also breaks down aspects of the devastation ripping apart Gaza right now, so content warning if you are having a hard time with everything that is going on. But I think he provides a unique perspective of how you can hold two true things together at the same time. So enjoy.
In a sense, partisan politics, uncompromising politics are seen as, well, that's the real problem. And I think that moderate politics often does take a side. I just don't think it has the courage to actually say it.
Okay.
1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, you know, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hi, Jonny.
How are you?
Good. Welcome to Called to Be Bad. So this is Jonny Rashid. He formerly served as pastor for Circle of Hope. And now he's at my brother and sister-in-law's church, West Philadelphia. And that's where we met. And I went and I heard Jonny preach, and I was like, I've got to get him on the podcast. Like, I just immediately could tell that you would make a great guest. So, yeah, I'm really excited to have you on, and we're going to be talking about politics today.
Mm-hmm.
So, particularly bad politics. But before we get into that, what are you drinking today?
I am drinking water out of this new pink Nalgene. I lost my Nalgene last week, so I ordered one promptly.
Losing a water bottle is I don't know, maybe I just get attached to inanimate objects, but I lost my water bottle, and it had a bracelet that my dad had made on it, and I was just bummed. Anyways. And I like that was a nice way to show off your beautifully painted nails.
Yeah, I have Halloween nails.
For just in time for spooky season. I didn't paint my nails, dang it. But I have coffee today, and I couldn't find any of my, none of my mugs have anything to do with politics, surprisingly. So I just picked a mug with a goose on it, just because, I don't know. Sometimes politicians can be silly gooses or something.
That's funny.
I don't know. My sister, her boyfriend just got a cat, and they named it Goose, which I think is an incredible name for a cat.
Goose is a great name for a cat.
Isn't that great? Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, should we talk about politics now?
Let's do it. Let's talk about politics.
There's no great transition. So we always start with definitions, and I know most people will know what politics are. But in your book, also let me just take a second to show off your book. Jesus Takes a Side by Jonny Rashid. Embracing the political demands of the gospel.
Yeah, so I think that it refers to public action in general.
Okay.
Sometimes we reduce politics to just the national politics, and then also a conversation between Democrats and Republicans. But I think it's important for us to see the political implications in all the things that we do. It informs how we live our life and understand it. So I think basically everything is political and has political meaning and, connotation. So I think it largely relates to concerns about power and status in the world.
Okay, so power and status, and it bleeds into everything we do. You
That's what
can't
I think.
neatly compartmentalize like religion, politics, culture, etc.
Totally.
Yeah.
If you look up politics, one of the later definitions of it will say something like the total complex relations between people living in a society.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I feel like I remember, like, isn't polis, like, isn't that Greek for, like, the city or, like, the public? I don't know. It's been a long time since I took Greek, but I feel like there's some Greek root. Are you Googling it?
I'm Googling it. Let's find out. I think it
Okay.
means that, like metropolitan, polis, yeah, a city and a
Right.
city-state.
So
Like a
again, kind of
metropolis.
tying back to, like, the public, what is public domain. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'm curious kind of your story, how, I mean, you talk about it in your book a little bit, and I guess that's what I'm kind of getting at here. How did it become obvious to you that um that everything is political, that our bodies are political, etc., and especially like how that started to relate to your ministry?
I was serving communion January 2017, and this was right after Trump was inaugurated as president, so it was right after the 2016 election. And he was inaugurated, and then the executive order for the Muslim ban was executed. And what that means is, what that meant at the time is that all these people coming from certain countries were banned from coming into the U.S. And so they were planning on coming in to visit or to immigrate or to whatever, and they were held behind. They couldn't come through. And that became a federal executive decision from Trump. And we all knew he was going to do it, but it was horrifying to experience. And it felt very personal to me as an Arab, because Arab countries were being specifically targeted. And at that moment, I knew I couldn't give communion without mentioning it. And I needed the cross, which we remember, and the death of Jesus, which we broadcast, to have the sort of salvific and political power to change circumstances like these. And I felt it in my body. I felt it in my person. At that moment, it was clear to me that politics wasn't just abstract, that it was personal and related to our bodies, and that as Christians, it was important for us to pay attention to when politics are a very bodily and material matter. I think when we talk about politics, quite often we think of them in abstract terms. And so we'll say things like we shouldn't let politics get between friendships or family or relationships. But I think that usually in those settings, we don't think of politics as having material significance or material consequence. But for me, it felt very personal and like something I needed to say and talk about. And I did. And I was very emotional. I mean, I cried. And I hadn't been crying a lot in my ministry before that. Actually, after that moment, probably more tears came more regularly. But it became no longer an abstract idea. It wasn't a neutral idea. It was much more significant. And as I reflected back on my life, I also noticed moments where, again, prejudice occurred. I experienced prejudice, and that shaped how I saw the whole world. It's hard to endure the prejudice directly, and so your body does things to protect you from it. And I think that happened to me in my youth too. But it was an extremely, after I had worked through some of that personally, to experience it again so viscerally helped make the connections.
And it's fascinating to me that like it makes so much sense that that this all came up like during communion, which for me feels like a very visceral, embodied ritual. All of that to say, it makes sense that kind of came up, especially during communion. You're like, I cannot partake in this without naming what is happening in my body.
Absolutely. That's how it felt.
Yeah. And I think in your book you talked about how afterwards some members of your congregation went and participated in a protest as
we had people that were very politically engaged, and so they left and protested at the airport at PHL in Philadelphia. So there was definitely some welcome reception of that, but I want to note that there was still some fear that like, oh, you're making the gospel, you're making the Bible political, you're bringing politics into it. Why do you always do that? You know, and there's a cost to that, and it was a cost I needed to take, a risk I needed to take, but it's definitely worrisome.
And so how do you respond when people say that? Like, why are you bringing politics into everything? Why does, you know, kind of like how politics have no space in the church, or kind of this idea that the church or religion transcend politics? How do you respond to that?
At the time, I don't know if I even would have had a response. At the time, I might have even said something similar. But the situation got so bad that I had to act. So all my thoughts about, like, why bringing this up was okay back then weren't formed. And eventually, I grew to understand the gospel as necessarily having political implications, necessarily freeing people from their oppression. And I was slowly coming to understand that from an intellectual place, but this particular moment accelerated it all.
Yeah.
It made it very visceral and clear to me.
Yeah, that's like exactly what I was going to say. So you had this kind of visceral, bodily, emotional response, and then later now have kind of reflected more theologically on it.
That's right.
Yeah. It's amazing how we have these moments that just kind of like, I don't know, something that just like kind of shifts and like clicks into place. My dad was a pastor, and he cried a lot in the pulpit and kind of gave a good model for how big emotions are good and okay.
That's nice.
I mean, in saying that, that is also gift that you gave your congregation, saying like it is I am human. This is who I am. You know, like, anyways, that we could go in a whole different direction with that.
Sure.
But so a lot of your book is about how moderate politics are kind of the bad politics, and not the way we talk about bad on the podcast, where bad is like good, but bad as in like antithetical to the gospel, to Jesus, to Christianity. So can you kind of take us there, tell us about that?
Well, it's interesting because I do think that most people think of moderate politics where people are seeing kind of both sides of an issue and so on. They see that as positive, good, bipartisan. We're compromising, we're coming to moderated policy goals, we're able to achieve some sort of consensus. And I think that that's very appealing to people. And I think that's very appealing to Christians. And I think there's reasons that Christians want that to happen. I think in large part, pastors everywhere have divided churches, purple churches, where we have people on kind of both sides of an issue. And so they're afraid to speak vocally about it because it can be costly. You know, a lot of pastors lost members and attenders during the Trump administration because they spoke out against Trump. And so and I know these pastors personally, and I know they're vocally opposed, not vocally rather, but they're opposed within themselves against Trump's policies, but they feel so trapped, so challenged to be able to speak openly about what the issues are. And so, like, I am sympathetic to that. In a sense, partisan politics, uncompromising politics are seen as Well, that's the real problem. And I think that moderate politics often does take a side. I just don't think it has the courage to actually say it. And I think most clearly it expresses itself in existential matters with regard to, I would say, race and LGBT inclusion probably more than anything. And I think specifically with LGBT inclusion, a lot of pastors want to find somewhere in between being affirming and not being affirming. But if the poles are affirmation on one hand and bigotry on the other, until you get all the way to affirmation, you're still in the band of bigotry. You know, you're just less bigoted than others. And to me, that's an untenable position.
Yeah. So moderate politics are taking a side. They're just not owning up to which side they take. And it tends to lean more conservative. Is that what you're saying? Like the
Yeah, I mean, if I
being
talk
moderate.
to if I talk to a pastor and I'm like, "Do you affirm LGBT people in ministry?" and they do anything but say yes, if there's any hesitation, then it's a no. Like I think that's cool. Oh, let me take you out to coffee. Let me talk to you about this. That's a big conversation. You know, we welcome everybody, that kind of thing. Where it's just like there's always some sort of caveat or further explanation, or this issue is really complicated and we want to be nuanced about it. And when they get into that territory, well, it's clear. Because if the answer is yes, just say yes.
And if not, if there's a but there, if there's a like let's go out to coffee, you're like immediately no. Immediately no.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in our congregation we're talking about the distinction between being welcoming and or affirming and belonging. Like it's not just like, "Oh, we are so gracious and kind and we welcome you in." It's like, no, like how can we create a culture that feels like everyone belongs no matter what? Like no caveats, no like, "Oh, yes, of course you are welcome here." It's like, no, we all belong.
Right.
So, can you say more about like how moderate politics, I don't what's the word I'm looking for, like how that's like not actually like what Jesus was going for. That's not the right way of saying it.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the, I think the Bible is for better or worse not a moderate text, and I think you see it, you know, from the very beginning. Like, it's clear that when the Israelites are being liberated, probably even to our discomfort, the Egyptians are bad and the Israelites are good. And God saves the Israelites. When Jesus comes, he says, "I'm here to free the oppressed." The prophets have a very clear preference for oppressed people. And that's the kind of framework that needs to inform how we see the whole world. And it is sometimes more complicated than that. And sometimes oppressed people are set against each other. But when we're talking about an oppressed group that's being persecuted by a very clearly more powerful group, I don't think there can be much of a debate about that. And I think that the sort of radical partisanship that accompanies social change can be really challenging. You know, a good example is Martin Luther King, you know, who during his time was considered to be very radical and was very unpopular, and did things that increased his lack of popularity. There was even I don't think I talk about this in the book, but there was even like a newspaper cartoon, a political cartoon, that like called Martin Luther King's marches riots. And I think that just shows us that we haven't had an ability to hold the experiences of the oppressed with the kind of dignity that we should. That for a long time we've been uncomfortable when a group collects power and then uses it. And I think that moderates really just want to maintain the status quo. The one credit I'll give to the people that reject moderate ideas because they're so far to the other way, at least they're honest. At least they say it with their chest. In many, many circumstances, now I'm only speaking for myself, but in many circumstances, I would rather you be explicit about the bigotry you hold than to be polite about it as if you don't hold it. So I'd rather have a conversation with someone like that, and then we can actually get somewhere. Or we can build power or move in a different direction and not be too concerned about kind of where you are, because you've clearly ruled yourself out. But if the trouble comes when we say yes but do no, when we say we want to do something and then we act for it, and then in every other instance you're moving slowly about it.
It seems very apt that you ended up in a Mennonite congregation where a lot of our politics, both like church politics and real politics, definitely wade in the moderate waters. I mean, yeah.
I find it very, I think Anabaptists have trouble engaging politically and sometimes think that they're acting in a way that is detrimental to the gospel or antithetical to the gospel because they engage in political ways. But we have beliefs that we are certain about, that we don't exhibit much nuance about, largely related to peace and nonviolence. But when it comes to issues of LGBT inclusion and anti-racism, it becomes more nuanced. So I wonder how much we are committed to peace and peacemaking if we can't take a side on those issues. I will say this, though. I think that is my general perception of Mennonites and Anabaptists, but I do think that, first of all, WPMF doesn't really exhibit those problems very openly. And secondly, there are many people in MCUSA who are resisting that as well. And so I just want to give credit to them, that they are challenging the status quo as it works. But yeah, I think we often believe that if we are too vocal about our political viewpoints, if we're too resolute, the body will be divided. You know, even in Anabaptist world, just this week, there was an article about how all these congregations are leaving MCUSA, and they're largely related to LGBT inclusion. And that's a painful circumstance. And so the other side of that argument is, if we weren't LGBT inclusive, we wouldn't have lost all these people. If we weren't LGBT inclusive, we would have been united, or we would have stayed united. The question that then needs to follow is, at what cost are we being united? Who is kind of bearing the burden of that unity? And I think that the most marginalized people are.
Yeah, and I never thought about how, like, how Anabaptist Mennonites do kind of have their values, have their extremes that they hold true to, that they actually, like, name proudly. But then there's all these other, yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting point. Can you talk a little bit about how Jesus's third way of being in the world gets misused, politically speaking?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that having an alternative way of approaching the politics of the world can be helpful. I think coming to compromises is important. You know, in my book, I write about how if we were in a group deciding what to eat for dinner, and one person said, you know, I want pizza, and the other person said, I want tacos, and we were having an intense discussion over it, because everyone would be fed at the end of it, coming to a compromise on that issue seems fine. But if the discussion wasn't about what we're eating, but rather about whether we were eating at all or whether certain groups of people were eating, then the conversation would change. Because there is no third way between feeding people and not feeding them. There could be one between what we happen to be eating, you know? And I think that that's important to make a distinction about. And to their credit, I think that there are moments where a creative solution is important. But I don't think those moments come when it is related to the dignity of people of color who are suffering under white supremacy and racism, and the dignity of queer people in trans people who are suffering under transphobia and homophobia and patriarchy. I think in those cases we need to have a clear side. But even lately, I've found some ways that I've been challenged about that. Now, when it comes to those issues, I'll get back to that in a moment. But let me say that term "third way," I think it comes from Walter Wink, who is trying to find a third way between the flight or the fight response to a conflict, and I do think it is useful in that way. I also think that civil rights in the U.S. and nonviolent resistance, which Martin Luther King and many other people were involved with, posed as a third way between two violent options. But these days, we don't see the legacy of civil rights and anti-racism as expressed today in the Black Lives Matter movement specifically as a third way. We want to find a third way between the movement for Black lives and essentially white supremacy. But using kind of our understanding of nonviolent resistance, the Black Lives Matter movement is, in fact, the third way. Yet it still makes us uncomfortable enough that we wonder, is there another way that we can make people feel okay?
Like on TikTok, the sound that's like, is there another door? Do you know that? Do you know that audio?
I don't, but I think I would like that.
Sorry. Yeah.
So I think that's how third way can be used appropriately, but I think most often third way is just like, oh, we're not affirming, and we're also not affirming. We have a third way of approaching queer people, We're not anti-racist, but we're not racist. We have a third way. Well, what is that third way? To me, it's like that's the question, And so that's what I'm interested in, I don't think we should fear polarization. I think when an issue becomes polarized, it shows you the stakes at hand. Because in one way of understanding it, you could say polarizing issues divide us. But in another way, you could say people feel really passionately about the issues that polarize them. And one of the reasons they do is because their lives are on the line. It really matters. It's like a huge deal. Like we're talking about trans suicidality, gay suicidality, material oppression of people of color, economic issues that really count for people's livelihood, healthcare, insurance, and so on. These things that they're not just abstract kind of political policies. They really matter in the lives of people. Now, we can have compromise if we agree about policy ends and goals. So you and I could both think that, the police needs to be reformed, immigration should be reformed, and we could have a variety of ways that we want to do that, but at least we agree with that. What isn't tenable is if you have people that think queer people are less than human, and then queer people in your church. People that think immigrants should be deported, and then immigrants in your church. People that think that it's okay for police to kill black people, and then black people in the church. So, what we're talking about aren't two different ideas. We're talking about one idea, and then groups of people affected by that idea. So it's not a conversation between a liberal and a conservative. It's a conversation between someone that holds a prejudice and that very person. And so finding a compromise there is untenable. One agent needs to change. The other agent is just trying to live. There isn't even a political motive besides decent treatment, dignity, equity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful because I'd never, I like framing the idea of polarization as in this doesn't have to be this big bag scary thing because it leads to division. It leads to division because it cuts to the core of humanity, of
That's
people.
Right.
It's life and death. I had never thought about it that way before. Going back to the third way framing, I told a story in one of my sermons, and it's and again, going back to TikTok, it's something I learned on TikTok that apparently so birds have been witnessed taking anti-bird spikes. You know, those like the spikes that they put on buildings to keep birds from nesting there. They have been ripping them from buildings, and they know that they're ripping them off. They're not just collecting them because they see the glue on the bottom. And they have been using them to make nests.
Oh, that is so cool. That's very interesting.
Yeah. And not only are they using them to make nests, which we've seen, they've seen birds, they've seen magpies use like barbed wire, and like, so it's not unprecedented for for birds to use like non-natural items in their nests. But they're using them as intended. They are using them with the spikes facing out to keep predators away from
their nests.
On their nests. And they know that they're doing this because we've seen them, scientists have seen birds taking like hawthorn bushes, like spiky, what's the word? Thorns, and making nests that are like more predator proof. So they know that they're doing this to like keep predators away. And for me, that is what I think of when I think of third way. And if that is not the most like politically badass thing, I mean, it's like ungovernable, like taking bird spikes and making new, like for me, that's like, I talked about it as third way, and Ben, my brother-in-law, was like, oh, did you know that Johnny has this whole thing about like third way? And I was like, I wonder what he would think of that analogy being third way. And for me, when I think of third way, kind of what you're getting at is like this creative means of transforming what was intended for violence into like new life.
There are issues that need a third way because both options are so violent. Okay. I don't think that we often think of it in that way. So, like, if you say, I'm unsatisfied with the political economy in the U.S., and I think both Republicans and Democrats serve capital and the market economy and the war machine, and we need an anti-colonial, anti-military, anti-capitalist movement. If that's your third way, that sounds fine. You know, that third way, so to speak, did get Jesus killed. But I just don't think that people think that a more radical option is somehow a third way. I just think it's something else. Now, if that's what we're talking about, that's a whole different conversation. That's just not what my experience has been.
Right. And we're speaking I'm speaking from an Anabaptist Mennonite perspective because that's the tradition I'm in and the kind of Christianity that I've witnessed for most of my life. Right. When Mennonites writ large talk about third way, they're not talking about anarchy. They're talking about like moderate, politically transcendent politics, which, to your point, is taking a side, and it's siding with the status quo.
Totally. It is beautiful if the lion and lamb can lay next to each other. You know, we see that in the text. And to others, it's like, can't you guys just get along? And the miracle in the lion and the lamb lying next to each other is that the lion doesn't want to eat the lamb. And if the lion still wants to eat the lamb, don't let them hang out. A lot of people will say, is your church safe for both people on the right and the left? And I'm not speaking for my church, but I can say for myself. It's not safe if the most vulnerable are harmed. And we see this throughout the Bible. When Paul talks about unity in the body of Christ, he says, elevate the members of your body that have been disrespected more. And to those who haven't been, you don't need to do anything. You're elevating them because they're more vulnerable, and you're protecting them and giving them special honor. To me, that's what it looks like. Your church can't be a safe place for queer people or people of color unless it is actively LGBT inclusive and anti-racist. Some people think a church like that isn't safe for people who disagree. They are invited onto a journey of transformation where they can grow and change. But if you don't want to change, if you don't want to grow, if you don't want to follow Jesus more readily, well then, this church may not be safe for you. I think it's really interesting that when we talk about safety in churches, so often the people we think of are like people on the right or white nationalists or something like that. How would they feel if they were in this church? The question we should be asking is, how would their victims feel? You know, frankly, there's plenty of churches that right-wing Christians can go to. There's not a lot of churches that queer people can go to. And the truth is, suicidality of queer people increases if they hold religion more highly. They're more likely to hurt themselves if they're churched. That's pretty terrible. And it demands a response from churches. And so we have to do our part to ensure that the safety of these people is paramount to us.
Yeah, that is exactly what I was going to touch on, is that, this is a different scale of safety. And I don't even think safety is the right word. It's discomfort.
Right.
At being met with opinion that is not your own, versus what you were saying, cutting to the very core of, what it means to be human. I guess one place, and maybe we touched on this a little bit, but I've heard this kind of idea that, both extremes are dangerous. Extreme right-wing politics, extreme left-wing politics, if they are leading to violence, or that they naturally lead to violence, and then therefore we should avoid the extremes. Do you want to touch on that a little bit?
I think it's important to name that politics that lead to death of any kind have problems, and that we should interrogate them. I also think we need to consider the roots of the violence and what it means. I do think that engaging in violence, political violence, is morally wrong. But I see a difference between invading the Capitol and rioting that occurs after an officer that killed somebody isn't found guilty, or we see another act of brazen violence. Because I do think that the anger is justifiable for people that have felt it time and again. I think that the anger on the other side was completely manufactured. And so that's complicated, I'm not questioning that the anger is real. I'm not questioning that the fear is real. But the circumstances that led to those things have to be interrogated in a different way. So when we talk about violence, we need to again imagine it within the framework of oppressed and oppressor, and understand that both sides being violent doesn't mean both sides are kind of equally wrong, even if they both are. It's a really, but that's a complicated question. I mean, the truth is that right-wing, white nationalist violence in the U.S. and hate crimes in the U.S. are significantly higher than other forms of political violence. That's just a fact. We know that. And yes, there is sometimes left-wing violence. And I don't support that. But if we want to talk about the end of political violence, there is one side clearly doing it more than the other. In the U.S. And so that's something we need to think about. But this conversation with you happens at a very, very challenging geopolitical moment. And
I wasn't sure if we wanted to go there or not, but go there if
I think
you
it
feel...
is really relevant. In fact, yesterday I can share this with you when it's out. It's right now, a few people are reading it, and then I'll publish it later. But I write on Israel-Palestine, you can do two things at once. And this is a growing edge for me. You know, I'm an Egyptian, and I have a very deep affinity and connection with my Palestinian brothers and sisters, my Palestinian siblings, I should say. And I feel that issue in my body too. But I also know right from wrong. And I don't have any issue at all condemning or decrying the attacks that happened in Gaza. I think that what Hamas did was terrible. And wrong. Plainly, morally wrong. There isn't a circumstance where assaulting women and kidnapping children is okay. There's no possibility for that to be justified. But if we don't contextualize that violence and the greater violence, and I'm saying that, of stealing land, colonialism, and funding it, we're going to get into problems. So I think that it's essential that we empathize here in this particular conflict with both sides. It is a unique scenario because I'm opposed to the settlements in Gaza. But for Jewish people that have a memory of the Holocaust, whether their grandparents experienced it or someone close to them experienced it, if a survivor is in their family, they remember what it is like to be persecuted and killed just because of your heritage and just because of your faith. And European anti-Semitism led to kind of the creation of Israel. Europe is still unrepentant about its anti-Semitism, I just want to say. And it is still rampant in Europe, and Jewish people aren't particularly safe in Europe because there's anti-Semitism all over. But, I understand that Israelis and Jewish people would be opposed to Hamas because part of their official platform is ethnic cleansing. So, that's terrible. I don't think the actions of the Israeli government have protected the interests of Jewish people in Israel and Israelis. Similarly, I think that the leadership of Hamas in Gaza is horrible and doesn't serve the interests of Palestinians. And now we're involved in a power dynamic that has geopolitical consequences that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are involved in, that Russia and Iran are possibly involved in, and now it's a mess. So now we're talking about political power, control of a state, and not the people that need the protection and need the dignity and need the possibility to have a livelihood at all. And so, which side am I on? I'm on the side of innocent people, both Palestinians and Israelis, that are being hurt by the actions of their leaders. The truth is 58% of Gazans support Hamas, including young people. These are people that have their backs to the wall and have no advocate. And so they pick the closest thing to an advocate. I don't think that's okay, but I wish they had better options. As outsiders looking in, we need to be led to lament and stand in solidarity with the most vulnerable. I understand that both anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred and violence is rampant all over the world. I also understand that Islamophobic and anti-Arab violence is too. And it is a shame that these two groups of people are posed against one another when we could be leading towards a world of cooperation. And frankly, I would say white Christians have exacerbated the conflict. And the U.S. in particular, because of how it funds Israel, does the same. Yeah. And it is rooted in its own interest. Again, geopolitical issues and issues of foreign policy are not often morally discerned. They're discerned because of personal interest and power, and the issues that I take a side with in my book and other places relate to personal matters of anti-racism, LGBT inclusion, personal power dynamics, and then also specific oppressions that exist within certain countries. Disputes over land of two oppressed people have a much different framework.
Sure.
So you can criticize Hamas without supporting apartheid, and you can criticize Israel without supporting anti-Semitism. You have to be able to do both, in my viewpoint. And you can't just do one or the other. If you don't understand the context that led to this attack,
Yeah.
and the violence of colonialism, people had their houses bulldozed by Israel. They had chemicals and weapons used that violated international law. And so, innocent Israelis that suffered, we should care about them. We should not want them to suffer. But if we decide to only care about them and not the Palestinians, then we're in an issue. And I do think a minority of, especially outside of Palestine, people that care about Palestine also care about Israelis. Now, there is some who don't have that. And I have no issue talking to my activist friends addressing that very problem, And I grew out of it in some ways. I learned to understand and listen to both Jewish people that want a safe home where one doesn't exist, and Palestinian people who want to have a country of their own that isn't colonized, that isn't settled by other people. And I think that the third way here is to look for moments of mutual cooperation between Palestinians and Israelis that want to have a common solution to this problem. And I think they exist. I don't think that serves the politics of power that normally frames this conversation.
So you were saying that your own posture towards this issue has kind of shifted to hold more nuance. Is that what you were saying there? Versus, is that what you were trying to say?
To an extent. I mean, I think Jewish people need to have a safe place to live where they're not persecuted because of their faith and their heritage. And I think that in Europe that's proven to be the case, and all over the world, including in Palestine. But I think Palestinians also need a place to live too. How do we bring about a solution that holds both of these moral goals in mind? They're not in competition. They don't have to be. So, in a sense, the side I take is with vulnerable Jewish people and vulnerable Palestinians. And it's not a zero-sum game. Yeah. That isn't the framework that often accompanies language about third way. Because before I was saying you have someone who is opposed to immigration and an immigrant. You have someone who is okay with police brutality and black people. You have someone who thinks queer people are less than human and queer people. Mm-hmm. Here you have two people groups. They're both people. And Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are both must be condemned. And using one for the other creates a huge problem.
Right. I heard a quote that said that the people aren't the problem is the problem. And when we treat the people as the problem, that is when we, create more violence, create more harm.
What Hamas did in Gaza will probably have direct analogs to 9/11 for a long time. And right after 9/11 happened, the language was like, united we stand with America. Some people said we're all Americans today. And there was a spirit of unity. And I think even Pete Buttigieg said, after 9/11 we were all united. Guess what? I was not united. I was not in that group. I was the enemy. So that doesn't always work. I stand with innocent people in Israel. Mm-hmm. And I stand with innocent people in Palestine, but I don't stand with Hamas, and I don't stand with the far-right government of Israel, nor its funders, including the U.S.
Yeah.
I think they add fuel to the fire. I don't think they come in a spirit of peace. And these are two vulnerable groups whose plight is being exploited for greater geopolitical interests.
Yeah.
And there's significant problems with that.
Yeah. So going back to your book, was there anything that you talked about in your book that feels like it cuts to the core of our conversation that you want to pull out, or have we kind of like hit all you? Not that we can cover it all, but
like I said, I don't think polarization is a dangerous thing, and I think bipartisanship leads to maintaining the status quo. I also think that the current political arrangement in the U.S. demands our participation, both in voting and canvassing and so on. But I hardly think that the Democratic Party in the U.S. offers hope to solve our problems. Because when we imagine a world, when we imagine the age to come, there is no violence, there is no economic inequity, there is no police brutality. You know, if we take Paul's words in Galatians 3:28, there's neither slave nor free, male nor female. If we want a world like that, we'll need to imagine beyond the political constraints that this present political economy gives us. It limits how we can think. So like I said, I'm an abolitionist. That means I believe in police abolition and prison abolition. People think that's an impossible goal. It's impossibly hard. It's never going to happen. And people will say that is counterproductive towards our progress. But I still believe in having a prophetic imagination about what is possible.
yes.
I'm never going to let that go just because I engage in the politics, in pragmatic and practical politics of the time. Just because I vote in every election, every year, twice a year, and encourage my neighbors and my family and my friends to also engage, doesn't mean that I don't have a practical an imagination beyond what the Democratic National Convention thinks is possible.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because those two are often pitted against each other. Like, okay, well, yeah, you can believe in this certain ideal, but we have to deal with, reality, what is practical. And you're kind of saying like we can do both at the same time.
Yeah, so engaging in politics practically is important, but also continue to have, like Walter Brueggemann says, a prophetic imagination about what's possible.
Yeah. Because that's the only way we are going to... That's the only way we can live into something like that, is if we first imagine it. Do you have any advice for those trying to actually be political in their discipleship? What like for the folks that are listening that are like, okay, I have been kind of walking this moderate line. How can I truly live out kind of how Jesus takes a side?
If you're listening and you're like a right-wing person or a far-right person, I don't think that I have much to tell you. But if you feel like disturbed at things like transphobia, homophobia, and racism, but you feel shy about acting politically because you're not sure whether Jesus would want you to, I think you should follow your conviction and follow your heart and wonder where you got that doubt about what you wanted to do. I want to give people permission to act in those ways, to vote, to canvass, to be activists, to organize, because there are real matters at hand that affect people's lives, and it takes all of us to change that. And so if you feel convicted, don't let the bad actors who have seized the political action of Christians make you hesitant to engage yourself. I think some people will see. We already have a sordid legacy with conservative Christians and how they vote, and we don't want to repeat that. Don't let them spoil your possibility. Don't let them poison the well, as it were. You can still engage. You can still fight for what you believe in, and sometimes that means engage in political action. participating in a broken system doesn't break it more. We do our best with what we've got. You can I reserve the right to not participate if the options before me aren't good. I don't need to do that. I don't feel obligated to do that. I didn't want to support Michael Bloomberg or Donald Trump, just like I don't want to support Israel's far-right government or Hamas. But don't let a problem in the system prevent you from any action.
Yeah. I want to give a shout out to Amanda Bauman, who really pushed Nick and I to go out and vote. She really motivates us politically. So anyways, thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, she's awesome.
Well, so where can we find your work and how can we support the work that you're doing other than buying your book, Jesus Takes a Side?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You can follow me at Jonny Rashid on any social media platform. JONNYRASHID.
Well, would it be okay, Jonny, if I end our time today with a blessing for you and all the baddies watching and listening out there? Jonny and all of you baddies out there, may you go from this episode motivated to take action where you can, to be clear and transparent with your values, to side with the vulnerable and the oppressed, and to dig deeper into the political nature of Jesus's ministry. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Mariah.
That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.